It's amusing that today, or just coincidental that today, is Ash Wednesday, the beginning of our church's season of kind of serious reflection, some penitence, to use an old-fashioned word, mortification or self-denial. And I think that talking about unplugging a bit, as we will, is it's an appropriate time to do that. I haven't been near a mirror lately, but I understand that my mark of ashes is stronger than your smudge. So hope that won't distract anybody. My message today is not exclusively about our society's attitudes towards the use of cell phones and other gadgets, but that's not a bad place to start. And I will start with a critique of how we're using technology, and then I'll move on to some other deeper analysis of the larger conditions in which we attempt to live out our Christian vocation. What helps or hinders us in our walk of faith, in our discipleship? That's really the deeper concern than anything we might say about technology. Along the way, we'll treat a number of the powerful distractions in our lives, and there's a fair bit of talk about consumerism as we hit the halfway point of my talk. Consider for the next 2 minutes 4 short vignettes that I will share with you. All 4 occurred during a single weekend, May of 2009, just about 9 months ago. While highlighting the pernicious effects of handheld mobile technology, each of these 4 incidents will say something about the human choices that we make, more than just the gadgets themselves and their qualities. Vignette number 1. Near the end of a Friday evening commute, outside the Government Center T station in the streets beneath Boston, a subway car abruptly plowed into the rear of another Green Line trolley car, sending people flying into walls and poles and each other, and injuring 49 commuters, some of them seriously. Luckily, there were no fatalities. The operator of that Green Line train immediately admitted to being distracted from his driving duties because he was sending a text message to a friend while behind the wheel. Vignette number 2. Minutes later, 2 miles west of that place, in a place called Fenway Park, fans roared with joy as the Red Sox tied a spirited game against their new arch rivals, the Tampa Bay Devil Rays. Okay, it's not the Yankees. Couldn't get tickets to the Yankee game. With a 3-run homer off the bat of slugger Jason Bay, sadly not with the Red Sox this year. Section 5 of the packed grandstand, where I was rocking as I rose to my feet to follow the arc of the ball, the towering fly that cleared the Green Monster by a few feet. The crowd went wild. But 2 nearby fans did not return my offer of a high five. They were too busy operating their smartphones, and they had missed the thrilling home run entirely. Vignette number 3. 36 hours later, the Minuteman Bikeway Trail that goes through Arlington and Lexington up to Bedford was filling up with joggers and cyclists enjoying the first truly warm weekend morning of the notoriously late arriving New England springtime. Lovely flowering trees were blossoming at last. A great crowd of songbirds, just back from winter hibernation, I guess, were serenading the eager folks jogging and pedaling along the 11-mile-long path. It's my own favorite ribbon of biking pleasure, as I call it. I don't know much about birds, but believe me, these songbirds were an especially good voice that morning. But many of my fellow exercisers missed the delightful, natural concert. Their ears were plugged into an iPod or a Walkman. I even spied a few parents sporting these earphones despite the presence of their children just inches away, strapped into carrier seats on the back of their bicycles. Classic case of a missed opportunity to connect with your kids. Vignette number 4, the final one. The beloved leafy Boston Common swarms in springtime with panhandlers, beggars, as we all know. Every winter is a hard winter for the homeless in our frigid city. One such gentleman, Dunkin' Donuts cup in outstretched hand, seemed inordinately glad for the few coins that I fished out of my pocket while walking down a bending path on Boston Common last May. I asked him about his take for the day. He sighed that Practically everybody passing by that afternoon was, in his words, out of reach. I interpret this to mean that most of my fellow strollers were locked into the interior world of music, streaming through earpods or in cell phone conversation of some sort. Fiddling with a handheld device turns out to be the perfect way to avoid eye contact with a beggar, and the perfect excuse not to hear a request for spare change. Now, I hold no particular brief for the practice of panhandling. I don't like it, frankly. But this incident did lead me to think of the story of Lazarus and Dives in chapter 16 of Luke's Gospel, in which the very existence of the needy man at his gate went unacknowledged by the affluent man, Dives. If technology is rendering this sort of deliberate oblivion more likely, then it seems urgent that we make the choice to unplug and to be attentive to the cry of the poor. Now, I've already added some commentary to these stories, and I've probably tipped my own hand regarding my opinion, if the very title of this talk or the advertising posters did not already do so. What do you think, however? What do you think when you hear these four stories? What lessons or learnings come to your mind and strike you as most urgent? What fears or concerns do they induce in you? Now, there's a wide range of possible concerns raised here. Let me list three bundles of concerns, although most of the talk will focus just on the third and final of these three. First, public health aspects. Actually, these might be the most important, at least in the short term, but I'm not going to dwell on this. Clearly, the Green Line trolley accident is a major public policy issue. It's a public health concern. The driver in question, in fact, was disciplined. As a regular rider of the T, I'm very pleased to know that he is no longer operating a green or red or orange or blue line of any sort. He's been dismissed. Also think of other public health concerns. Automobile accidents caused by cell phones and similar distractions. Last month, I saw in the January 7th New York Times, to be precise, a front-page story calling attentions to the dangers posed by pedestrians, not drivers, pedestrians, walking along the sidewalk, bumping into all kinds of things, poles and intersections and cars and each other, creating dangerous situations. And another third and final public health concern would be, and I don't know much about this, radiation exposure. There are parts of the country that are very concerned. The state legislature of Maine is investigating whether radiation and cancer comes from a cell phone. So these are, at least some people think this is a serious public policy application. Now, just a word of disclaimer. Most of my work as a social ethicist is done on social justice and public policy. So I have to resist the temptation to dwell on this public policy angle. We're really talking here about personal policies, people's decisions in their spiritual life of what to do with their time and maybe how to increase their prayer and reflection and not diminish it. So I'll try not to be a problem solver here with public policy. That's the first. The second area of concern is the social aspects of our use of technology. Simple rudeness to people, in the people who are right in front of you, maybe even sharing a dinner table or any other experience, a conversation with you, which all too often gets interrupted by the ring of a cell phone. For example, new questions are surfacing that come under the category of etiquette. When you're dining with someone, can you check your messages? Can you answer a phone at a business meeting? There's a woman named Amy Elkton who was interviewed recently in the Boston Globe. She's a popular advice columnist. She makes her living, as far as I could tell, answering questions about the etiquette, the protocols regarding how and when to use technology in the presence of other people without hurting their feelings. Her best-selling book is called I See Rude People. I haven't seen it, but I understand that the final chapter is called It's Nice to Be Nice. I guess we need to hear that these days. There seems to be, it's very obvious an observation to say that people should be attentive to people in front of them, but reading the advice columns, and some of you could probably confirm this, a lot of questions come up about when it's safe, when it's appropriate, when it's good etiquette to use technology. Here's my full disclosure before I hit the third topic, which is the spiritual side. My full disclosure is this. I suspect I am the least qualified person, at least in this room, maybe in the world, to make recommendations on such matters. Although I'm not a pure Luddite, I use a computer every day, I have somehow steered clear of most of the distractions that enthrall the tech-savvy among you. I have never in my life owned a cell phone. I have never sent a text message to anybody. Believe it or not, I have never been on Facebook or MySpace, those major social networking websites. I have consistently declined invitations to even my closest friends to join their networks. LinkedIn seems to be the big one. Don't know a thing about it. I have blogged exactly 4 times, always on special requests, usually from America Magazine, as a matter of fact. In short, I don't know a BlackBerry from a Blu-ray. That's the end of my Luddite confession. It leads me, though, to our third, and this is the major point of the talk. That was all wind-up in a sense. Here's the pitch. This presentation is not about the threat of technology to our physical health or public policy, or to our social health, etiquette. It's about the threat to our spiritual and religious health. I suspect that's why I was invited to join in this C21 series called Growing Faith, the Journey of a Lifetime. The very possibility of growing faith in each one of us, or the Christian community in general, depends upon the development of a very important word, interiority. Time and time again in the Gospels, Jesus goes off to lonely, deserted, far-off places to pray. It actually annoys many of his disciples. Nowadays, there seems to be no place that's far enough away, at least from technology in a wireless age, a digital age, to be free of distractions, as Jesus enjoyed. With all the demands of work and expectations from families and friends and networks, are we really free anymore to unplug? Are we free to spend adequate time? Time, I would say, we need for our spiritual health in solitude. Some people call this part of the human condition or the modern condition. I don't want to use the word condition. I want to use the word problem. It's a problem if we can't clear out space, not a mere condition. My earlier examples, the 4 examples I opened with, make the point that using handheld devices may indeed have the good effect of connecting us with people far away. But it also leads us to sacrifice more immediate human connections, such as to the children on the back of those bicycle carriers. And it may have the effect, or from panhandlers, or it may have the effect of cutting us off from our relationship, not with just other people, but with God. At least making it harder to build that spiritual life with and under God. We all know that being in the moment, being deliberate, being undistracted, being attentive to the subtle promptings of the Spirit is part of our spiritual life. It's a precondition for prayer and reflection. Now, my talk is not all bad news. I have noticed, following the media, it's funny how that works, you follow the media to critique the media. I've noticed a number of case studies, instances, where there are people who are speaking out, acting out against this creeping tyranny of the use of technology and machines. There are institutions that sponsor programs to break this cycle. Often these are described not in distinctively religious terms, using spiritual language, talking about prayer and meditation, but sometimes simply in secular themes like mindfulness and distraction, the topic of today's talk. Here's one example. I was delighted to learn that my own alma mater, Amherst College, go Lord Jeffs, a college located in western Massachusetts, recently instituted a periodic day of mindfulness on the campus, offering meditation breaks to students and faculty, including people on the campus, to take a fast from media and technology. I applaud this. I wish more colleges would do that. I was also pleased that this very campus, Boston College, when it was visited by filmmaker Ken Burns, he gave the commencement address last year, Ken Burns issued a warning about how mobile technology disengages people from one another, even as it purports to connect us to one another. Now, at that time, Ken Burns was just coming off the filming of his excellent PBS documentary series on the national parks. So perhaps his perception of the importance of peace and quiet was somehow influenced by his recent work on that project. Shooting scenes from Yosemite or Yellowstone has a way of making you appreciate peace and quiet, I suspect. Other examples of this movement, both secular and religious in motivation, could be cited. The evidence encourages me to believe that we are witnessing at least a modest revival of interest in what Henry David Thoreau expressed in his book Walden, Life in the Woods, over 150 years ago. Namely, a yearning to live life more deliberately, to simplify, to make room in our cluttered lives to get in touch with our truest selves and with our God. If Thoreau felt that daily life in American society was too cluttered back in the 1850s, how much more so does this observation ring true in the 21st century, thanks to our ubiquitous technology. Now, these voices that I just cited are expressing a dissatisfaction with the current state of affairs. Life simply moves too fast for comfort these days. Our intersection with people and with data proceed by a new style of bursts and fits and snippets, featuring frequent, constant distraction, interruption, eliciting shorter and shorter and shorter attention spans. It's as if our entire society is suffering from ADD, attention deficit disorder. While we might be gaining something in speed and efficiency and rapid response by always being plugged in, always jumping on your emails, I'm mostly conscious of what we are losing. The loss is in terms of sustained attention, as we're pulled away in too many directions simultaneously, and we suffer from information overload. We're not just harming our brains and our nervous systems. The point of my talk is we're harming our spirits as well. Now, taking the long view, humankind in every age of its history has displayed the ability to adapt to new circumstances. We adapted to the dawn of the written word, which replaced the spoken, the epic recited poems. We adapted to the age of the Gutenberg press, which replaced literature that scribes had written. Now we have mass-produced books. We adjusted to the dawn of the industrial age, factories, mechanization that replaced craft guilds and home-based production piecework. How successfully are we going to adjust to this new age of digital technology? I don't know the answer to that question. I don't think anybody knows the answer to that question, but we should definitely pay attention to the habits of mind that we are developing or sacrificing. We should pay attention to the question, is this information overload sustainable? I don't think that anybody really knows the answers to these questions, but we might come up with a few, at least reliable hunches. Almost paradoxically, the way to get these hunches is to pay attention to the very media that saturates our lives and comes at us through our technology. So I'm going to do that, though. The best set of clues that I've gathered on this topic comes from the recent episode, it was just aired February 2nd, 2010, of that documentary series Frontline on PBS. If you're interested in pursuing more about this topic concerning information overload, I would say that the best single thing you could do is find that 90-minute feature. It's posted on the PBS website. It's called The Digital Nation. And as a matter of fact, the subtitle of the first segment of those 90 minutes is Distracted by Everything. This documentary contains some sobering testimonies from people who, upon some pointed questioning in interview format, expressed genuine surprise at how thoroughly digital technology has taken over their lives, so that the dawn of this age, the age of the internet, emerges in a lot of these interviews as really a great divide between what happened before and what's happening after, in how people work, how they play, how they communicate, how they organize their lives and their time. The more we think about it, the more we realize that nowadays we are always wired, always connected, always online, always multitasking. This Frontline documentary portrays veteran professors at MIT who are lamenting in front of the cameras that their students today seem to require, or at least they prefer, Constant and multiple stimulation, qualitatively beyond the scope of anything that we'd experienced in earlier decades or generations on our nation's campuses. My favorite segment of that program includes a bit of a point-counterpoint between two groups of people. On the one hand, a group of college students, they're MIT students, who claim boastfully that they can skillfully multitask while performing homework or problem sets or all kinds of reading for their courses without sacrificing any comprehension at all. On the other hand, are some professors who, in a good interview format, they muster some very convincing scientific data, they are after all MIT professors, demonstrating that their students are seriously deluding themselves. Reading comprehension, writing skills, and ultimately course grades and knowledge attainment are negatively correlated with attempts to multitask and to stay plugged in around the clock. In the end, the trump card in this debate involves brain research and neuroscience, something I know nothing about, which can adjudicate these claims and counterclaims. The best data available seems to suggest that we can do well only one thing at a time, and that switching among multiple tasks costs us dearly in terms of efficiency and accuracy. And I would contend that there are other losses as well, harder to quantify, the spiritual level, which we'll get to momentarily. The bottom line for me is the realization that there are some things that simply require stillness for us to understand. The documentary I was viewing did not use that language, but it did confirm my hunch in this matter. More disturbingly, perhaps, the deepest truth here is that our society and our social conventions, in effect, are creating people, our young people, who are less able to think clearly, and I would add, less able to be in touch with God. I went away from my viewing of that Frontline episode documentary convinced that we are distracting ourselves to death, satisfied to master only easy and discrete tasks, answering emails, arranging your electronic calendar. But we're really scurrying to find any excuse to avoid taking on difficult concepts or nurturing creative thought, things that require more concentration. And I would add to that list, maintaining a healthy habit of prayer. Let me step back a bit. What other conclusions can we draw? One judgment, heard from time to time, is that our society-wide tendencies appear to resemble addictive behavior. Playing video games is usually what comes up, and that activity has already been clinically proven to qualify as addictive behavior in the strictest clinical sense of addiction. Behaviors that render us powerless to alter them. Internet use in general displays, at least to me, certain features of being a process addiction of some sort. Some people, many people, simply do not know when to stop or how to wean themselves off hours and hours on the internet. They're out of control. It appears to be beyond their capacity to use this technology well and to use it in moderation. In other words, we are dealing here with the reality of becoming unfree regarding our use of technology. This lack of freedom is one of the classic marks for spiritual concern. By the way, to me the most disturbing piece of evidence in that Frontline documentary concerned a case study. The government of South Korea has just started a program called Internet Rescue Camps. Teens who literally cannot turn away from internet use, and especially video games online, are brought to these camps, and obviously the government is funding it. They think it's a worthwhile thing. Get these kids weaned off of this technology. Maybe you know a person or two who could use an intervention like that. Now, so far I've sprinkled in just a few references to prayer and spirituality in the midst of reflections upon larger trends in our society, mostly on technology use. Besides experiencing a call to practice a lifestyle for ourselves that includes prayer and contemplations, as Christians, we're also called to nurture the next generation as they, our young people, discover what it means to be reflective people of faith. That's why I think this talk fits very well into the series, Growing Faith, the Journey of a Lifetime. The task of handing on the faith from one generation to the next generation impels us to turn our attention to the youth of today, There's been quite a bit of recent attention to the topic of the role of media and technology in the lives of young people today. And what we're hearing has implications for parenting practices and for family behavior models. Although I am not a parent myself, here is my angle on what is at stake for the next generation. I especially worry about young people's curiosity, their creativity, their critical intelligence. I fear that all these things are being compromised by our soundbite culture, by media techniques like those quick cuts that go from scene to scene on the camera screen or the TV screen. And this renders impressionable youth prone to short attention spans, as far as I could tell. Their sources of identity are so wrapped up in overheated consumer culture that I worry that their fragile struggle for identity will not be able to unfold in a way that is truly free. Now, I'm eager to avoid any contention that my generation grew up in a golden age of any sort. I don't want to lay that trip on any of us. I can still hear my parents telling me to turn down those Beatles records. Remember the age of vinyl? I love that age. Or other technologies. We had early videotapes, we had cassette tapes, we had all kinds of lower tech than we have today. So the narrative I'm offering here is not one of a simple and sudden fall from grace to some horrible situation now. It's been a shading, it's been gradual, it's not all at once. But I would contend that the overall ecology of technology use today is qualitatively different. That the challenge of forging responsible use of media for youth today is a far more formidable challenge than we've ever had before. Supporting these concerns is a front-page article in the February 4th Boston Globe reporting on a recent study conducted by the Kaiser Family Foundation. It's available online very easily. This study found that young Americans between the ages of 8 and 18 now spend an average of 7 hours and 38 minutes a day using either a computer, smartphone, television, DVD player, video game console, iPod, or some other electronic device. Previously, the measured total was 6 hours and 21 minutes back in 2004. So from 6:21, it went up to 7:38 in just the space of 6 years. Okay? And that was the latest report from the Kaiser Program for the Study of Media and Health. These findings reflect the explosion of mobile and online media today, including text messaging, handheld video games, social networking websites, Facebook, MySpace, and among the findings is that 37% of children report that their family car now has a TV or a DVD player. So kids go from screen to screen to screen all day with hardly a break. By any standard, these 50-plus hours per week is a lot of screen time. And surely, electronic activities crowd out valuable time for activities that are healthier for mind and body and spirit as well. Once you add in all those 7.5-hour daily, put on top of that another 8 hours for sleep, I think kids still have to sleep, right? And a few other hours for meals and other necessities of life, I wonder if there's any time at all left over for genuine human interaction, for educational activities, much less for prayer and quiet time for reflection. And there's no indication that we've hit the ceiling on the growth of screen time, although I have a hard time imagining what is left to crowd out. They'll find something. This Kaiser study I just cited also documents that excessive time spent by youth in this way is correlated with behavioral problems, with lower grades in school, with decline in personal contentment variables, asking children if they're happy or they're looking forward to a good future, and also correlated with childhood obesity, the big campaign of our First Lady, Michelle Obama. She just adopted that cause, fighting childhood obesity. Sure, time on your Xbox or the Wii console that most families seem to have today, or in front of the TV, may have some benefits. You could be exposed to new information, you get better hand-eye coordination, I guess, if you get better at video games. But we all know that, left to themselves, children, by and large, will consume junk. They will waste time. We can all agree that there's a desperate need for closer supervision and alternatives that parents can provide for these children. 2 weeks before the release of that study, the New York Times carried a front-page article, it was January 20th, titled, "If Your Children Are Awake, They're Probably Online." More through anecdotes than hard numbers, this New York Times story chronicled the same trends that the Kaiser study that I just reported relates. The article prompted a slew of letters to the editor. A whole bunch was published on January 28th, a week later, expressing agreement with the observations in that article. One letter is my favorite one, from a high school English teacher in Queens, New York, close to where I grew up, related an anecdote. As an experiment, this teacher some months ago had challenged her students to abstain from electronic entertainment technology for 3 days. Sadly, but not surprisingly, a very small percentage, I think less than 10%, could actually follow through and meet her challenge. Many of the students described their media deprivation as torture, I'm quoting now, wicked boring, and the hardest 3 days of my life. But some of them did get through 3 days. Some of them actually found alternative ways to entertain themselves, discovering the joy of activities that occur offline, even some of them, shockingly, outdoors. And some of these kids actually expressed appreciation for this challenging exercise. Score 1 point for the world beyond cyberspace. Another educator who demonstrates concern for his students' inner lives is a gentleman named Brian Mahan, co-author with Michael Warren and David F. White of the recent volume called Awakening Youth Discipleship, Christian Resistance in a Consumer Culture. Brian Mahan encourages his students to keep a thing called a distraction diary. It's a notebook where students can keep track of the thoughts and daydreams that interrupt them while they're reading material for his courses. Dr. Mahan then follows up with students to make sense of their learning experience based on what they record in their distraction diary. I might add that this would not be a bad practice for spiritual directors to challenge their spiritual directees. Keep a distraction diary. Help us to understand our prayer through the distractions. Let's leave the buzzing, blooming world of cell phones, internet, and other technologies for a moment. Let's consider the wider tableau, the larger landscape that these technologies populate. The subtitle of the book that I just cited from Brian Mahan and his co-authors was Christian Resistance in a Consumer Culture. Did you notice that phrase? Allow me to reserve the word resistance for the very end of the talk, but let's ponder together the reality of consumer culture for the next few moments. Technology and the way we use it are obviously only one facet of the overall social ecology that we find ourselves inhabiting in the 21st century. The larger universe includes the all-encompassing reality of consumerism, which has come to resemble an ocean in which each one of us swims every day, like it or not, from the moment we wake up until we close our eyes again. It's nearly impossible to avoid advertisements, brands, product placements, commercial activities of all sort in the course of a day. Try watching a sports event. Every surface is covered by an ad for something. In putting together their book on the challenges of fostering youth discipleship, Brian Mahan and his co-authors accurately identified consumerism as a powerful, even ubiquitous, a word they used, ubiquitous force that is decidedly hostile to Christian formation, discipleship, and religious practice. If you compare the power of the culture of consumerism on one hand and the relative appeal of a life of Christian discipleship on the other hand, I'm afraid that culture all too often wins out over Christ, if I can borrow H. Richard Niebuhr's phrase, Christ and culture. I'd like to think that religious motives and values trump the acquisitive and commercial side of us, but I fear that this may have become a lost cause in recent years. To turn the tide, we would have to somehow find a way to renew widespread popular appreciation for practices that provide an alternative to relentless purchasing and consumption. Practices such as sacred remembering, meditation, and discernment. But such practices require quiet and stillness and unbroken concentration. And these virtues are hopelessly out of vogue. A reversal of fortune would require us to appreciate the old virtue of asceticism, of bodily mortification, like fasting and silence. These are a hard sell in an age of instant gratification. It might seem grandiose to refer to these as countercultural practices of resistance, but I've come to realize that they are nothing less than that. Consumerism is such an important phenomenon of our day that a number of prominent Christian thinkers have chronicled the challenges that consumerism presents to faith in our age. Let me mention 5 recent book-length works that have added to our understanding of this topic. I'm simply going to list 5 books, it's a very small literature review, that I've used in courses with theology students, future ministers in the church, including here at Boston College. First, one book was written way back in 1981 by my brother Jesuit John Kavanaugh of St. Louis University. His book, many of you know it, Following Christ in a Consumer Society, The Spirituality of Cultural Resistance. There's that word again, resistance. It was such a popular book that new editions were published on the 10th and 25th anniversaries of its publication by Orbis Books. Kavanaugh is not afraid to make the bold claim that authentic faith today, situated in a consumer society like ours, must be culture transcending, that it must be prepared to stand up for values that are not popular. Christian approaches to the basic human functioning, such as knowing, valuing, and willing, cannot be shy about being distinctive. Kavanaugh also notes that while advocating for social justice is only an optional part of the consumerist lifestyle, it remains an essential part of the Christian message, social justice. In short, an authentic Christian faith is going to make us look different, look odd, different from many of our neighbors in today's consumer society. Second book. In 1987, political scientist Michael Budde, B-U-D-D-E, of DePaul University, published a cleverly titled volume. Here's the title. The Magic Kingdom of God, Christianity and Global Culture Industries. The Magic Kingdom of God. The word magic is in parentheses because it precedes a somewhat older phrase, Kingdom of God. It's older than the Magic Kingdom, at least by a few years. This book falls readily in the field of culture studies. It's engaged in analyzing media, advertising, and various patterns by which we communicate today. Michael Budde exhibits a very playful knack for analyzing trends that we've already probably seen and suspect in our world. The way that television and mass media have a pernicious way of dominating our lives. He calls them time bandits. They rob us of precious time and energy. Time and energy we could use to be more creative than just sitting in front of the boob tube. Serendipitously, the title of the book's first chapter is this: Following Jesus in a Distracted Age. Michael Budde sees the Christian life is difficult to maintain in a world of modern capitalism, in a commercial culture. Living a consumerist lifestyle is a recipe for seeing religious practices squeezed out of our daily lives. And it's obvious to him that true Christian formation for our youngsters is almost impossible today. Media screams for our attention, CCD, less convincing. The best soundbite, by the way, from that book occurs when Michael Budde worries that Mickey Mouse is currently generating more influence and enthusiasm than Jesus Christ ever did. Jesus never generated any prophets, at least the kind spelled with the letter F. P-H-S. If Christianity has a future, it will have to take up this challenge in a conscious way, as Christians recognize the call to be countercultural, even subversive. I'll use a word that Budde uses frequently. Third book, Tom Bedoin, 2003, published a book, Consuming Faith, Integrating Who We Are and What We Buy. It's not just another book about consumerism. It's really a book about meeting the challenge of faithful living in a mass consumption society. And he agrees with Buddy. Christians have to be more strategic about their choices and savvy in their lifestyle options. The fourth book, Being Consumed, Economics and Christian Desire. It was published in the year 2008 by a gentleman named William Kavanaugh, spelled with a C, unlike the K that begins the name of John Kavanaugh, whose book I cited earlier. This Kavanaugh restates the insight of his namesake in perhaps more stark terms. He says that, and I quote, "Nowadays, God and mammon are contestants on the same playing field." Consumerism and hyperdrive has a way of warping our Christian approaches to realities like abundance and scarcity, hope and anticipation, gift and exchange. For the foreseeable future, Kavanaugh says, it will be a real struggle for Christians to create practices and spaces that are truly free from economic domination, including the consumerist drive to get more for ourselves, something that's clearly, sharply different and at odds from the Christian principle of self-giving love. The fifth and final book I want to mention is the most scholarly of the whole lot. It's by Vincent Miller, who now teaches at the University of Dayton. In the year 2003, he published the book Consuming Religion, Christian Faith and Practice in a Consumer Culture. In this book, Miller conducts a thorough theology of consumerist culture today, the spend and consume ad infinitum culture, achieving a comprehensive analysis of the phenomenon of commodification that dominates our culture today. I recommend putting Vincent Miller's analysis side by side with two works by a Boston College professor, a sociologist named Juliet Schor. Many of you probably know her two best-selling books, The Overworked American and The Overspent American. I like that dialogue between sociologists like Juliet Schor and theologians like Vincent Miller. We can really learn a lot about what it means to live in our age of distraction. In the face of runaway technology, consumerism, and other cultural and market forces that threaten us with utter distraction, in this light, anyone desiring to lead a truly centered and deliberate life will have to make a massive effort to reject what is contrary to Christian commitment, or at least to filter out what threatens an authentic Christian lifestyle. For some, this will mean saying no to mobile technology or to unlimited time on the internet. Perhaps it means fighting our addiction to shopping and buying and consuming, activities fueled by advertising and corporate manipulation. I suspect that for all of us, this vital project is a matter of getting in touch with our deepest longings, our desires that cannot be met by possessing material things or mastering the latest technological gadget. Of course, we do not face these current challenges, formidable as they are, empty-handed. We can draw from rich treasures of the Christian tradition, a variety of resources to help us resist what needs to be resisted. I'm thinking here of spiritual writers who inspire us to detachment. I'm thinking of gospel texts that challenge us to place material things in proper perspective. I'm thinking of old-fashioned virtues, the classic virtues, like self-restraint and temperance. I'm thinking of masters of prayer techniques who encourage us to use our Christian imagination to visualize alternatives to the status quo. All of these and more are at our fingertips if we can only master the will to bring them out of storage and to install them into our daily lives. Resisting the market culture of consumerism and regaining control over distracting technologies are ultimately challenges that we work out in the tension between gospel and culture. This relation between gospel and culture is always being worked out in every age anew. The dialogue between them is always potentially creative, and probably surprising. Who knows? Maybe the Holy Spirit is filtering into our world precisely through new technologies and the cultures that accompany them. I don't want to rule that out, and it happens in spite of these novelties, perhaps. It's probably a good idea not to be too dogmatic about the downside of these new technologies. Any positive side can be found if God wants it to be found. God will discover it. There's ample room for optimism as long as we remain open to the promptings of the Spirit. It's also clear that culture often distorts and sometimes even dismisses the gospel. So it's a give and take. There's an optimistic side, and there's reason for pessimism as well. Surely we are justified in insisting upon some minimum level of silence and stillness to clear an internal space for God in our lives, to allow people of faith to be attentive to the inner voice that whispers, "Be still and know that I am God." In my final 3 paragraphs here, I'm in the home stretch. I've offered you a diagnosis regarding what it means to live a true Christian life in this age of distraction. To draw out that medical metaphor after diagnosis, I'd like to offer a prognosis or even a prescription of some sort. But I'm unsure what it might consist of at this point in our history. If we expect to find a healthy way to live, we're going to have to think our way into new modes of acting as surely as we act our way into new modes of thinking, to cite the old saying. We will surely have to clarify our own definitions of what it means to be successful in the world. And we must present alternatives to the dominant cultural paradigm of achievement in our age. At the very least, we're going to have to resist those aspects of our high consumption and high-tech culture that are antithetical to Christian living. It may sound grandiose to speak of the complete transformation of culture. I'm not expecting any complete transformation of anything anytime soon. But I certainly do not advocate complete withdrawal from contemporary culture, as flawed as it is. Perhaps the proper approach is to encourage Christians today to be more deliberate, more selective in how they engage mass culture and use technology, to dare to stand apart from our culture and critique its most corrupt aspects. And maybe the most valuable contribution is not any position-taking or commentating, as I've done today, but rather the simple task of modeling for others what it means to be deliberate, to make lifestyle choices in a mindful way, to resist cultural trends that we can find unhealthy. As an ethicist, my ultimate criterion of progress in the moral life is always the question, are these things helping us to be our best selves? It boils down to a simple matter of encouraging healthy behavior and discouraging whatever it is that inhibits human flourishing, of being the most authentic people we can be. If we encounter trends or cultural influences that infantilize us and retard our spiritual development, we're obligated to resist those trends. This is true for adults. It's also probably truer for our youngsters, who will never achieve their full potential unless we create the conditions, favorable conditions, for their development as Christians. Youth will struggle to build a strong sense of their identity and their place in the world unless we adults provide sound and attractive role models for them. Specifically, they will not be able to resist the lure of constant media stimulation unless we show them that we can unplug, at least from time to time. Faith formation isn't just what happens in a classroom or a CCD class. It's what happens in our daily lives for one another. At stake is nothing less than the health of the social ecology of our world, which makes prayerful and faithful living either more likely or less likely. To conclude, my deepest hope for the future years is that we as a society will witness fewer, not greater, missed opportunities for reflection, to drink in the ordinary joys of life that humankind has experienced for millennia. Simple things like watching sunsets, pondering the night sky, activities that all too often we forego now because we're too plugged in. Connecting with God, connecting with others in a deliberate way is still within our control, if only we can muster the willpower to resist modern distractions and to turn them off. None of us should have to flee the world or enter a monastery simply to avoid sensory overload. We can and must make the right choices. So, I wish you a happy Lent, a distraction-free Lent, and most importantly, a Lent when you can maintain at least some modicum of spiritual focus. Thank you very much.